a brave woman spoke out. Theresa Mallet protested on behalf of herself and a group of more than 100 other patients of the disgraced surgeon Salem Eljamel. Dr Eljamel left NHS Tayside patients who came for help scarred, broken and devastated. Theresa wants answers. She is demanding a public inquiry. But when Humza Yousaf was Health Secretary, he refused to grant one. So can he tell Theresa and all of the victims of Dr Eljamel why he refused to grant that public inquiry?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I have agreed to meet with Ms Mallet and I'm due to meet with her, I believe, early next week. And of course, when I was Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care, I also met a number of other victims of Professor Eljamel. And let me start this answer by reiterating just how much sympathy I have for the trauma that they have undoubtedly suffered at the hands of Professor Eljamel. Let me also put on record that a number of MSPs from across the backbenches have raised issues on behalf of their constituents who again have been traumatised by the disgraceful actions of Professor Eljamel, including his own backbench colleague Liz Smith as well. What I would say to Douglas Ross is that as First Minister, indeed Michael Matheson as Cabinet Secretary for Health, we will continue to not just engage with all of those who have been affected by Professor Eljamel's disgraceful actions. What we'll seek to do is get the answers that they want. And that goes to the heart of why a public inquiry hasn't been completely ruled off the table. The reason why we haven't committed to a public inquiry on the issue of Professor Eljamel's actions is twofold. First and foremost, we all know in this chamber that a public inquiry can take some years, rightly so, understandably so. And therefore, is there a way of getting the answers that the victims Professor Eljamel want? Can we get that sooner? Can we get it quicker, as opposed to often the years and years it can take for a public inquiry? That's the first reason why we haven't instructed a public inquiry. The second reason, of course, is that Professor Eljamel is not in this country. He is practising, I believe, as a doctor elsewhere overseas abroad. The likelihood of Professor Eljamel, I think, cooperating with any public inquiry is very low, and therefore would a public inquiry be able to get the answers that the victims like Ms Mallet and others are seeking. So I will end where I started, which is a public inquiry hasn't been ruled completely off the table. But what we're seeking to do with all the victims of Eljamel is, can we get them the answers that they deserve in a way that is quicker and more expeditious than going through a public inquiry?
Douglas Ross.
So if I can take the 2 points that the First Minister has mentioned. First of all, the pace of a public inquiry. Surely the quicker it is actioned and starts, the quicker we can start to get answers for victims like Theresa and so many others. And secondly, we shouldn't be letting Dr Eljamel off by assuming that he will not respond or cooperate. He is a key part of this, but there are others at NHS Tayside and the victims that we need to hear from. Because Ms Mallet told the First Minister on Saturday that she wants people responsible to be under oath so victims might finally get answers that I think the First Minister and I both agree they deserve. The First Minister also mentioned the cross-party support that have actioned this with the current Health Secretary. They met with Michael Matheson in April. He promised an update by the end of May. We're now at the end of June and my colleague Liz Smith has written to him twice in the last week seeking that update. This morning he responded to say he is currently too busy to meet with the cross-party group but will look to do so in the coming weeks. But surely, given these allegations came to light more than a decade ago, we cannot wait any longer. So can the First Minister ensure that his Health Secretary responds to all MSPs who are concerned about this immediately?
First Minister.
Well, as Douglas Ross referenced in his question, Michael Matheson has obviously engaged with cross-party MSPs. I have engaged, and indeed Health Secretaries before me have engaged in this issue, not just with cross-party MSPs, but with the victims of Professor Eljamel. And it would also be fair to say that a range of actions have been taken to try to learn the lessons from what has happened in this traumatic and tragic case, and to hopefully prevent another case like this happening. But it should be made clear that the responsibility for the actions of Eljamel sit with Professor Eljamel himself, a disgraced surgeon, and therefore it is right, of course, that NHS Tayside does look to learn lessons, but I don't think we should ever, and I know Douglas Ross is not doing this, ever look to abdicate Eljamel of the actions that he was responsible for. Douglas Ross will undoubtedly be aware that a review was commissioned by the Scottish Government, including detailed reviews of the care received by a couple of victims of Eljamel who have spoken out very publicly, and I applaud them for doing so, Mr Kelly and Miss Rose. And that was undertaken by 2 independent consultant neurosurgeons, and the recommendations of those actions have been accepted by NHS Tayside. The reason why I mention that review is that there may be, again, an option short of a public inquiry that will allow an independent review into cases to look and to explore what more can be done, what could be learnt from what is a tragic episode for all of those who have been affected. In terms of Douglas Ross's direct question, of course, Michael Matheson absolutely will respond. I know this is the last, of course, FMQs of the session, but we are going to continue, of course, all of us, I suspect, work right throughout the course of the summer. So I would expect Michael Matheson, he will, of course, make himself available where he can to continue to engage, not just with cross-party MSPs, but also with the victims of Professor Eljamel.
It is indeed the last FMQs of the session. I have many members who are keen to put questions to the First Minister today. Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I stress again, this is an issue that Scottish Conservatives, Labour, Liberal Democrat and SNP members met with the Health Secretary about in April, were promised an update in May, have been told this morning it will now be several more weeks. There is an urgency here, and I hope the Health Secretary and the First Minister can agree to update the concerned members today. Give them that update today before we leave for the summer recess, and then there can be further updates through the summer, because there are so many unanswered questions here, Presiding Officer. The First Minister mentioned 2 victims and said NHS Tayside had accepted the outcome of the independent review of their cases, but the victims haven't. One of the patients, Jules Rose, who the First Minister mentioned, says, I have still not got answers 2 years on from the independent review of my case commissioned by the Scottish Government. So how can I be reassured that the new independent review will help patients? That's what they're saying about the current process being suggested by the First Minister. Now, a Freedom of Information request published by the Scottish Government this morning contains minutes of a meeting held between NHS Tayside and Dr Eljamel on the 3rd of June 2013. During that meeting, Dr Eljamel seems to have got off practically scot-free. Junior doctors are blamed in this for mistakes made by Dr Eljamel, and the Health Board seems to accept his heartless promise to, and I quote, maintain the quality of his service. That is just scandalous. So when he was Health Secretary, did Humza Yousaf demand to know from NHS Tayside what they knew and when they knew it?
First Minister.
Yes, I had a range of conversations with NHS Tayside, including with the Chief Executive and the Chair, on this issue of Professor Eljamel. Of course, Douglas Ross will be well aware, and I'm happy to ensure that he gets a written update in this regard of the actions that were taken forward by NHS Tayside. I am not standing here. I suspect, in fact, I know that the Chair and the Chief Executive of NHS Tayside would not say that there were not lessons to be learnt from the tragic case that has affected so many victims, including Miss Rose and Mr Kelly, 2 patients who I have met and that we'll continue to engage with. In terms of the specific issues around engagement with patients, there is there has been an established process for former patients of Professor Eljamel to contact NHS Tayside, and there is also an independent mediator that's been appointed to work with NHS Tayside and 2 former patients whose experiences were reviewed by the Scottish Government and 2 independent consultant neurosurgeons. So that engagement with patients absolutely will continue. As I say, there are some outstanding questions that I know patients want answered. I do believe that we can work with NHS Tayside to try to get those answers. There is a request being made by a number of MSPs by Douglas Ross for a public inquiry. It's not ruled off the table, not taken off the table, but I do think that there may be other ways to get the answers that Miss Mallet, Mr Kelly, Miss Rose and many other victims of Eljamel absolutely deserve.
Douglas Ross.
The Freedom of Information request that was published this morning by the Scottish Government also shows that complaints were mounting from victims, but in many cases were dismissed. Complaints were growing as well from NHS Tayside staff, who appear to have originally raised the alarm back in 2009. But healthcare professionals say they were warned not to speak out. One whistleblower said, "I did raise concerns at the time, but I was shut down. It went all the way to the board. They knew about it." The First Minister is saying that a public inquiry is not off the table, but he needs to be clearer. He needs to say it is on the table, it is going to happen. The actions of Dr Eljamel ruined people's lives, but the actions of the Health Board suggest a cover-up at the highest level. First Minister, doesn't this simply demand a full public inquiry?
First Minister.
So again, I would take the points that Douglas Ross raises in turn. In terms of the whistleblowing processes in 2009, I think by any objective observation, there has been improvements in terms of the whistleblowing processes. I've met myself when I was Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care with whistleblowing champions in our territorial health boards. There have been improvements in the whistleblowing process since 2009, since that particular statement was made by the member of staff. My predecessor, when stood here, did often say, and I will reiterate this point, that whistleblowers can, of course, and should go through the appropriate whistleblowing route, but if they ever want to contact the government directly about concerns that they have, they can absolutely do that too. We take issues of whistleblowing extremely seriously, indeed, regardless of which health board is affected. So again, I will really end where I started in terms of the questioning from Douglas Ross. This is an incredibly serious issue. It's an issue where individuals have been left utterly traumatised. We will work with those individuals, those victims, those survivors, in order to try to get them the answers they absolutely deserve. And of course, a public inquiry is not ruled off the table, but let's look at how we can get them the answers they deserve as quickly as we possibly can.
Question number 2, Anas Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, this week the UK COVID inquiry has started to take evidence from Scottish Government witnesses. It is the first we are hearing from the Scottish Government in any public inquiry about their response to the COVID pandemic. 3 years on from the start of the pandemic, bereaved families are still waiting for answers. But here in Scotland, families are going to have to wait even longer, because last year the chair of the Scottish COVID inquiry and its legal team walked out. And we still have little idea of when the inquiry will begin questioning ministers and officials, let alone when it will conclude. So, First Minister, will grieving families get the answers they deserve by the end of this Parliament?
First Minister.
I can thank Anas Sarwar for raising what is an incredibly important issue indeed, and he will be looking at and observing the UK COVID inquiry, for which, of course, there are a number of Scottish witnesses in front of the UK inquiry today. Anas Sarwar, as an experienced member of this Parliament, of course, will know that it would be inappropriate for me as the First Minister, deeply inappropriate for me as the First Minister, to interfere or intervene in what is an independent public inquiry. Of course, we want the COVID inquiry to be delivered at speed, but what I will say to Anas Sarwar is, having met the bereaved families myself, I can completely understand why they want that COVID inquiry to move, the Scottish COVID inquiry, to move at pace. It's so important that the COVID inquiry takes the necessary steps. It has to get those answers in a transparent way and manner. And the final thing I'll say to Anas Sarwar, and which I'm happy to repeat time and time again, whatever we can do to cooperate with the inquiry from the Scottish Government, we absolutely will.
Anas Sarwar.
I hear what the First Minister said, but this is important for thousands of families who have lost a loved one, to NHS and care staff, and everyone across Scotland who will be frustrated by the Scottish inquiry running behind, because we must learn the lessons of the pandemic. But the inquiry's conclusions will only be as good as the evidence it receives. Over the past few weeks, people have been horrified by the UK Government's decision to withhold evidence from the UK inquiry. In Scotland, the Scottish Inquiry team issued do not destroy letters to public bodies, including the Scottish Government, last August. It made clear that all documents, including emails, texts or WhatsApp messages, should be retained, and that any destruction of these messages is a criminal offence. So can the First Minister confirm that all ministers and officials, past and present, have complied with the Do Not Destroy instruction, and will he give a guarantee that all requested emails, texts or WhatsApp messages will be handed over in full to the inquiry?
First Minister.
Yes, they will. And of course it is important that I abide by the rules of both the UK Public Inquiry and the Scottish Public Inquiry. Section 17 of the Inquiries Act 2005 gives the Chair alone the responsibility to decide how an inquiry should operate. It's therefore a matter for the independent inquiry chairs to make decisions as to what material they request from the Scottish Government or indeed from other participants. Both inquiries have taken the decision, again, the independent decision, not a decision that I interfere in whatsoever, but both inquiries have taken the decision not to publish details of the requests they are making to participants. But all participants, including the Scottish Government, have been asked by the inquiry not to share the content of requests that they receive. And so, of course, the Scottish Government will comply with the request. But to ensure there is simply no doubt whatsoever, any material that is asked for, WhatsApp messages, emails, Signal, Telegram, whatever is asked for or requested, will absolutely be handed over to the COVID inquiries and handed over to them in full.
Anas Sarwar.
So this is really significant. So to confirm, the First Minister has told us that all ministers and officials, past and present, have complied with the Do Not Destroy instruction, and that all ministers and officials, past and present, will hand over all evidence in full without omission and evasion. As I say, a really significant intervention from the First Minister. Because COVID took a heavy toll on everyone across this country, and we continue to feel its impact. The least we can expect is that when grieving families come looking for answers, this SNP government provides them. Because we know, sadly, that this is a government famed for a culture of secrecy and cover-up. Last week, Dr Lisa Mitchell-Casey, the lawyer for the bereaved families across Scotland, said this at the UK COVID inquiry: "No person, no institution, no matter how powerful, whether it be in England, Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, Westminster, Holyrood, can obstruct the search for truth." So will the First Minister commit to writing to me and other members of this Parliament outlining what steps the Scottish Government has taken to ensure that all ministers and officials, past and present, have complied with the Do Not Destroy order, and how this data is being retained and how it will be handed over to the inquiry?
First Minister.
Well, I think that question from Anas Sarwar is because he didn't expect me to, of course, say that I would fully comply with the COVID public inquiry. So he was not able to adapt his second question as a result of the answer. So I'm happy to reiterate what I've already said to Anas Sarwar. This is a really important issue, so the Labour may not want to heckle this point. I think it's really important for me to absolutely reiterate that we have, of course, and have had a long-standing policy on retention of documents, and not just documents, in fact, as per email or written correspondence, but including social media messages. So I'm more than happy for that guidance to be shared. I'm more than happy to write to Anas Sarwar or any other member who has an interest around how we comply with those various guidelines that are very much in place. What I would also say to Anas Sarwar is this is absolutely about the bereaved families. That's why the Government has met with the families who have been bereaved by COVID. We will cooperate fully with that inquiry. Anas Sarwar suggests that we are not transparent. I would remind him it is this Government who instructed that public inquiry. And I would also remind Anas Sarwar, in fact, it was my predecessor who stood up every single day during that pandemic to face questions from the press in order to communicate as openly and transparently as possible. So we are transparent as a government. We'll continue to be transparent.
First Minister,
and we will
First
continue.
Minister, If I could stop you there, could we please stop having conversations across the aisles? It makes it very difficult to hear. First Minister.
And we will continue to cooperate fully with both public inquiries.
Thank you. Question number 3, Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Presiding Officer, to ask the First Minister when the Cabinet will next meet.
First Minister.
We'll be meeting a few times throughout the course of the summer recess.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm very grateful for that reply. Reinforced, autoclaved, aerated concrete is a light and bubbly material that was used in public sector construction for decades. Think of the inside of an aero bar and you get the idea. But in February, NHS Scotland issued a safety action notice. It warned that roofs, walls and flooring made of this material are, and I quote, at risk of catastrophic structural failure, which could occur suddenly and without warning. A school roof has already collapsed in Kent. Now, Liberal Democrat research published in The Times has established that this concrete has so far been found by at least 4 Scottish health boards and in 37 schools up and down our country. It's above patients and it's above pupils. I am not trying to frighten people here, but we do need to identify the buildings at risk and fix them. That could cost tens or hundreds of millions of pounds. So will the First Minister establish a national fund to help hard-up health boards and councils make these buildings safe?
First Minister.
I appreciate and thank Alex Cole-Hamilton for raising an important issue around aerated concrete. What I would say to Alex Cole-Hamilton before discussions on any fund that may or may not be necessary is really important, as Alex Cole-Hamilton alludes to in his question, that we understand the scale and the scope of the problem and the challenge that we're facing. And therefore, I'm happy to write to Alex Cole-Hamilton with more detail, but I'll give him one example in relation to health boards. NHS Assure are already conducting a review into this issue, quite an intrusive review actually, to understand the nature of what we're dealing with and the scope of what we are dealing with. So Alex Cole-Hamilton is absolutely right to raise a very important issue. I will give consideration to the matter he raises around a fund, but before doing so, what I would say to Alex Cole-Hamilton, it's really important, imperative in fact, vital that we understand the scope and the nature of what we're dealing with, and thereafter I'm happy to give consideration to Alex Cole-Hamilton's suggestion. I will write to Alex Cole-Hamilton with details of the reviews that we're conducting in buildings that we are responsible for.
Question number 4, Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what steps the Scottish Government is taking to help raise awareness of the importance of stem cell donation in the treatment of blood cancer and blood disorders.
First Minister.
Thank Bill Kidd for raising this important issue. I fully agree that increasing awareness of the importance of stem cell donations is absolutely vital, especially in those where more donors are needed to sign up, including men and those from BAME communities as well. I myself have been in the register for stem cell donors for nearly 2 decades. The Scottish Government recognises the importance of stem cell donations and continues to promote it alongside key partners like Anthony Nolan through a number of initiatives. We have included information on our Organ Donation Scotland website, which provides the public with information on how they can register as a stem cell donor, and I would encourage everybody to look at that website and to register. Last year, we also launched our updated school resource to educate children and young people about organ donation, about organ tissue and stem cell donation. Nationally, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service and Police Scotland have partnered with Anthony Nolan to promote stem cell donation and encourage staff, young people and school pupils to register as a potential donor. Lastly, our new cancer strategy, which will work towards improving cancer survival and providing excellent, equitable access to care.
Bill Kidd.
Thank the First Minister for that reply and join him in welcoming the partnerships which take place with the Anthony Nolan Trust. And I note that he mentioned the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. Will he also join me in congratulating the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service on receiving the Shirley Nolan Special Recognition Award for its efforts to raise awareness and inspire others to sign up to the stem cell register for the Anthony Nolan Trust?
First Minister.
I absolutely will. The Scottish Fire and Rescue Service deserve every bit of credit for the excellent partnership work that they do with the Anthony Nolan Trust. I absolutely echo Bill Kidd's words and once again congratulate the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service on their well-deserved award. I think I should also, Presiding Officer, take the opportunity to recognise the tireless work of Bill Kidd in highlighting the importance of stem cell donation, and that was rightly recognised, in fact, by the awards. He was rightly recognised as Political Supporter of the Year at Anthony Nolan's Support Awards, and very well deserved indeed.
Question number 5, Jackson Carlaw.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the recommendations in the report Transvaginal Mesh Case Record Review by Professor Alison Britton.
First Minister.
Well, can I first put on record my thanks to Jackson Carlaw and others, but I think it's important to recognise Jackson Carlaw's tireless efforts in standing up for and advocating on behalf of those women who have suffered as a result of transvaginal mesh implants. I am grateful to Professor Britton and her team for undertaking what I think, what I don't think actually, I don't doubt for a minute, is a very thorough and insightful piece of work. I would express my thanks to the patients who took part in the review. I sincerely hope that they found it beneficial, and I don't need to say to Jackson Carlaw or anybody else in this chamber how traumatic and re-traumatising it can be for those survivors to continue to tell their story. We have taken many steps already that address a number of Professor Britton's findings. We've introduced new training for GPs about mesh, we've improved information for patients about the specialist mesh removal service in Glasgow, and the Chief Medical Officer continues to champion shared decision-making through his Realistic Medicine initiative. However, we will, of course, now study the report in great detail and consider what further steps have to be taken.
Jackson Carlaw.
Well, can I thank the First Minister for that and for his engagement with the issue? And I wonder if he would commit, when the Government has responded in full to the report, to a full chamber debate in the autumn for us to consider it. But can I ask him to react to the observation by Professor Britton in the introduction and overview to this report, where she comments on a parallel report she was invited to undertake by the now Deputy First Minister in 2017, and which was published in 2018. And she says this: the report highlighted a number of failings and made recommendations on how independent reviews should be conducted in the future. Despite being well received, to date none of the 46 recommendations have been implemented by the Scottish Government. Now, he's referred to the work that colleagues across the chamber have done over the last decade with these women. Does he understand their dismay and frustration that none of 46 recommendations made 5 years ago have been implemented? And can I ask him, what will he do to rectify that?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I'm very happy for the Government to commit to bring a debate forward to this chamber in order to discuss and engage again in this important issue once we are ready to respond to the latest review. In terms of the 2018 investigative review, we did accept and agreed with the vast majority of Professor Britton's conclusions, and those recommendations have actually already been reflected in a number of inquiries and reviews that have been established in recent years. We're also developing guidance to support inquiries and reviews that will very much build upon Professor Britton's recommendations, and hope to publish that shortly. And I'm happy to communicate with both Jackson Carlaw and, of course, with Professor Britton directly to give Jackson Carlaw and her and anybody else who has some concerns around those recommendations. But I can give an absolute commitment that not only have we agreed, but a number of those commitments, those recommendations, forgive me, have been already implemented in reviews that we have taken forward.
Take a brief supplementary from Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be very much aware of my support for a number of my constituents who have suffered the horrors of transvaginal mesh implants. And the women have my unwavering support in their efforts to firstly have the mesh removed, and secondly seek answers as to why the NHS services have often seemed to work against them instead of for them. Now, notwithstanding obviously what the First Minister has said today, can I ask the First Minister to ensure that the report is considered and responded to as soon as possible, given the continued difficulties many women and my constituents across Scotland are facing at present, but also because of the lack of trust many women actually have had in the NHS, particularly with regards to mesh services?
First Minister.
Can I thank Stuart McMillan and again recognise the tireless advocacy that he has done on behalf of constituents who have been affected by the implantation of transvaginal mesh. I think for me it's incredibly important to reiterate that I pay tribute to the women who have come forward bravely over the years to tell their story, because Stuart McMillan is absolutely right. Many of them have used words like gaslight. They have not been believed, that they don't have trust in the authorities and the NHS in the various processes that we have brought forward. So it's so important that everything we do, we bear in mind that lesson, that we ensure that we give the survivors in these cases trust in the processes that we're bringing forward. And I've met many women, some of them constituents of mine, others right across the country, who have suffered as a result of transvaginal mesh being implanted. So we will respond, as Stuart McMillan asks, we will respond as soon as we possibly can. And as I've said in my response to Janice and Carlaw, I think it would be a good idea that he suggests of bringing a debate to this Parliament so we can have a full and frank discussion and debate about it.
Jackie Bailey, brief supplementary, please.
The review also recommends that all information on mesh is drawn into a single website to keep patients informed. Will the First Minister commit today to publishing waiting times on the website to inform patients about how long it will take to get their treatment, given that some are being forced to wait as long as 448 days? Will he take action to end these unacceptable waiting times as a matter of urgency?
First Minister, concisely.
Well, I'm more than happy to look at what more we can do to be transparent as we are around waiting times. When I look at, for example, the Glasgow mesh service, there's simply no doubt that that has been affected because of the pandemic, and surgery was paused for a time due to particularly COVID and winter pressures. However, I was looking at the Glasgow mesh service latest data on surgeries since they have been restarted. That service will soon be able to operate within 12 weeks of the patient and their clinician deciding upon the course of treatment. So we are making progress around some of the treatments that are available, but I will look into the issue around transparency around waiting times and report back to the member.
Thank you. Question number 6, Monica Lennon.
To ask the First Minister whether he can provide an update on the Scottish Government's commitment to roll out universal free school meals amid concerns that there will be further delays to the expansion of universal free school meal provision for primary 6 and 7s, and that no progress has been made on the Scottish Government's commitment to establish a secondary school pilot scheme.
First Minister.
Well, can I say I'm very proud of the progress that the SNP-led Scottish Government has made in the universal rollout of free school meals, P1 to P5, maybe a lesson for other political parties right across the UK to look towards Scotland to see what we have done. And I can give a commitment to Monica Lennon and for all of those who are interested that we are absolutely committed to the rollout of universal free school meals in primary schools. And we have set out, as we have set out previously, the next phase will be to all primary 6s and 7 pupils in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment. That's the next phase of that universal expansion. We're also committed to delivering the pilot, on a pilot of free universal school meals in secondary schools, and we'll continue to work closely with our delivery partners, including, of course, local authorities, on our expansion programme, which includes considering the appropriate timescales for rollout.
Monica Lennon.
The Scottish Government was leading the rest of the UK on universal free school meal rollout, but the work has stalled, First Minister, and we are falling behind. Under Nicola Sturgeon, the P6 and 7 expansion was delayed, and last year's announcement to pilot provision in secondary schools has amounted to nothing. Close working would suggest communication. I have FOI'd every local authority. There's not even been a phone call from the Scottish Government to any school or council in Scotland about this. Instead of prioritising hungry children, the Government approached COSLA at the start of this month to broker further delays. Astonishingly, councils are now being warned the full rollout in primary schools may not happen within this Parliament. Children are going hungry today and they cannot wait until 2026.
Can I have a question, please, Ms Lennon?
Will the Scottish Government keep its promise to Scotland's children? And can the First Minister guarantee that the rollout will be delivered by the end of this Parliament?
First Minister.
I would love to see the evidence for Monica Lennon's claim that we are falling behind other parts of the UK. It's simply untrue. We are leading the rest of the UK when it comes to provision of free school meals. If I look at the uptake, for example, in 2022, over 215,000 free school lunches were provided to children and young people. That's an increase from the previous high of 194,000 free lunches provided in 2016. Registrations for free school meals have reached their highest ever level as our free school meals expansion programme continues. So yes, there are challenges in relation to the rollout. We know there are challenges around, for example, the capital infrastructure that is required in order to ensure that we can progress that universal rollout. And when it comes to ensuring we tackle poverty and child poverty in particular, I would remind Monica Lennon, it is the SNP-led Scottish Government that introduced the Scottish Child Payment, and it's estimated through the actions that we have taken with this limited measure of self-government, it's estimated that will lift 90,000 children out of poverty. It is the SNP-led Scottish Government that, for example, has scrapped tuition fees, something that Labour Party have U-turned. And of course it is now the Labour Party in the UK that have now said they will not progress with free school meal provision in the rest of the UK. So instead of chiding the Scottish Government for what they're actually doing, Monica Lennon may well want to speak to her own party and get them to follow the SNP's lead.
Thank you. I'm moving to... Actually, I'm going to take Brian Whittle. I would ask for a brief supplementary. And then we will move on to constituency and general supplementaries.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wonder if